Welcome to our viewers to today's lecture or symposium on the topic of Syrian refugees in the Middle East and Europe on the psychology of a humanitarian challenge. This program is being sponsored by the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland, and with a co-sponsorship with the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair at the University of Maryland. And I would like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair, who has assisted in organizing today's event. I will introduce our distinguished panelists in just a few minutes, but I'd like to first go over some technical matters. When you join this meeting, you are muted and your video is off. And please note that the program is being recorded and it will in a few days be placed on the YouTube channel. By participating in this program, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, or voice possibly being recorded. You will have the opportunity at the end of the program to pose your questions by going to the Q&A function on your screen. And this will happen once the panelists have finished their presentations. The Bahá'í Chair for World Peace is actively involved in addressing topics that are central to our understanding and pursuit of peace. And it seems that that topic becomes more important as events unfold in the 21st century. We accomplish this goal not because we think we have all the information and the know-how, but rather because we seek to craft a living archive, the words of wisdoms of scholars, of intellectuals, lay people, non-governmental groups, and social initiatives in order to assist the cause of peace. We wish to contribute and promote sound scientific research on peace that expands knowledge and strategies and explores the role of individuals and institutions in removing obstacles to peace. We do this by promoting 5 themes: structural racism, learning about human nature, the equality of women as a prerequisite to peace, global governance, and the problem and challenge of the environment. Today's topic, as I mentioned, is about Syrian refugees and the movement of human beings from one region to another, whether because of human conflict or natural disaster, is really not a new phenomenon. It has been with us historically for a long time. Humankind has always faced the challenge and even embraced the promise of resituating individuals forced from their homeland. Yet this ancient reality has grown more complex in our modern world, even as our modern world has been slow to embrace global structural solutions. Even if we are content to remain in our national silos, the refugee crisis has and will create waves that touch on the furthest shores as our world grows increasingly interconnected. Our speakers today examine one of the greatest human calamities of our time, the Syrian refugee crisis. The reality of this crisis reveals much about the promises and limitations of world refugee efforts, exposing potential solutions and scalding failures in equal measure. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce this wonderful distinguished members of this symposium panel today, beginning with Professor Arie Kruglanski. He is a distinguished university professor of psychology at the University of Maryland in College Park. He is recipient of the National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientists Award, the Donald Campbell Award for Outstanding Contributions to Social Psychology, the University of Maryland Regents Award for Scholarship and Creativity, and the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the Society for Experimental Social Psychology. He was fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences and is fellow of the American Psychological Association and the American Psychological Society. He has served as an editor of many, many journals. I won't list them all. You can see his full bio on our website, but he has, his works have been disseminated in over 370 articles, chapters, and books, and has been supported, he has been supported by many grants, including the project that they will speak about today. So Dr. Kruglanski will, in a sense, moderate and introduce, the program today. But before he does that, I'd like to move on to the second panel member, Dr. David Weber. He is an assistant professor in the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at the Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Weber uses social psychological methods and theories to study the radicalization and de-radicalization of violent extremists. He is the co-author of The Radical's Journey: How German Neo-Nazis Voyaged to the Edge and Back. This was published in 2019. He has published in respected academic journals, including the Journal of Personality, Social Psychology, Terrorism and Political Violence, American Psychology, and Political Psychology. Dr. Erica Molinario is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Maryland, College Park. She received her PhD in social psychology from the Sapienza University in Rome, Italy. Dr. Molinario's research interests focus on motivation, human goals, and groups and intergroups processes. More specifically, her work focuses on understanding psychological processes behind human behavior, such as pro-environmental behavior, violent and benevolent extremism, and political attitudes and activism. At the University of Maryland, she is involved in several funded projects, including the research on refugees residing in Middle East and Europe and host communities' attitudes towards refugees. Dr. Katarzyna Jasko is an associate professor at the Institute of Psychology at the Jagiellonia University in Poland. Her research focuses on issues related to political engagement, such as motivation to participate in collective action, political extremism and ideology, and political violence. It is with great pleasure that I now turn the time over to Dr. Kruglanski to introduce this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hoda, for this very nice and generous introduction. We are all very delighted to be here. We are not actually physically here, we are electronically here. We come to you from various corners of the world, Italy, Poland, Virginia, and DC. And we are very excited to share with you our initial findings from our research on Syrian refugees. This research was supported by the MINERVA program at the Department of Defense, and we are very thankful for the MINERVA support for basic science. Let me start by noting that human displacement is constituting a major challenge facing the world in 2021. In 2019 alone, 8.7 million people were displaced, with 30,000 people displacement occurring every single day. The first slide, please. As of now, the number of displaced persons worldwide is a staggering 79.5 million. compare it with the number of displaced persons after the Second World War, which was the greatest number in history by that time, and it was between 11 and 20 million. So now we're fourfold the number of displaced individuals as compared to Second World War. The trigger for refugee displacement then, as now, is safety. For the most part, therefore, they stay in the countries that are close to their country of origin. They simply escape the harm's way, and therefore they do not go very far. A minority, however, sees this opportunity, this opening that displacement provides to move further at this occasion. And some of these end up deciding to move to the West, where in 2015, they contributed to what has become known as the refugee crisis. Why is it a crisis? Until recently, this problem of refugees and displacement has been approached pretty much as a short-term humanitarian issue handled by the UN. And the UN strategy has been to establish refugee camps that provided food, clothing, and shelter until people could go back home. Because of this assumption that the problem is temporary, refugees were typically denied the right to work and to enjoy free movement in the host country. But this approach that maybe worked in the aftermath of the Second World War is totally out of place and out of sync today, 70 years later. It clashes with the reality of the here and now. Currently, their average duration of the refugee status is a decade, and very often much longer. For example, in the example of the Palestinian refugees. Some people are born in refugee camps, marry in refugee camps, have children in refugee camps, and die in refugee camps. So we need to seriously rethink our approach to the refugee issue, because this issue is unlikely to go away anytime soon. If anything, it's likely to grow, and it is causing misery and suffering for millions of people. And it is in the spirit of this endeavor, trying to rethink, trying to understand it better, that we initiated our extensive research on the Syrian refugees, whose initial findings we will be sharing with you today. Why Syria? We focused on Syria because in recent years, Syria has been the largest contributor to the flow of refugees, accounting for the total of 15 million displaced persons, including 6.6 million refugees. The distinction between displaced person refugees is refugees are persons who cross the boundaries of their country of origin. Next slide, please. The map that you see in front of you depicts the countries in which we have worked. We have 2 countries in Europe, Germany and the Netherlands, and 4 countries in the Middle East, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan, all of which absorb substantial numbers of refugees. Turkey with the largest number of refugees, Lebanon with the second largest, Germany with the 4th largest, and Jordan with the 3rd largest. So these are countries that are not selected in random. They have dealt with the refugee problem in a major kind of way. We started our research with a survey in 2016 conducted with 1,000 Syrian refugees in the 4 Mideastern countries that you see in front of you. And we continued 3 years later in 2019 with a series of 12 focus groups and conducted with 127 Syrian refugees in Germany, the Netherlands, Lebanon, and Jordan. And then in this past year, we carried out surveys with more than 1,700 Syrian refugees, again, in Germany, Netherlands, Lebanon, and Jordan, and with the host communities in those countries will be reporting primarily the research that we've done in refugees. Now, the way we've organized our presentation is in terms of three assumptions, widespread assumptions that are typically made about refugees. And so let us start with the first assumption that will be discussed by my Polish colleague, Katarzyna Jaszko. Throwing it to you, Kasia.
Thank you. Okay, so if we can move to the, thank you. So I'll start with this assumption that seems to be an uncontroversial one, namely that refugee migration is forced, that it is driven by security concerns, and that it is temporary. And why I'm saying it's not controversial, because refugees are defined as people who have been forced to leave their country of origin due to war, violence, extremism, persecution, or natural disasters. And because they had no control over their fate in such dire circumstances, it is also assumed that they will want to return to their country of origin as soon as this is possible. And also because of that, the measures that are put in place to assist refugees in this situation, such as, for example, refugee camps, are temporary structures and that are available to refugees until they are able to be resettled. And finally, those structures, those solutions mostly address basic needs of refugees, such as security, shelter, access to food and water, because again, it is assumed that these are the needs that are predominantly frustrated in the refugee circumstances. So I'm going to look more closely at those assumptions. And definitely we are not disputing the fact that refugees are indeed fleeing violence. And this is true, and this is particularly true in the case of Syrian refugees who fled Syria because of war and violent extremism. And to illustrate this, let's look at the next slide, where we have a very dramatic account that was told to us in our interviews in focus groups in Germany. And you see a part of the quote. I'll read the full quote, which says, it was Ramadan and we had woken up to eat in order to fast the next day. ISIS had entered our city. From 4 a.m. till the next day, my youngest son and I hid under the bed. We could hear everything happening outside, the murders and screams. We could hear our neighbors screaming, "We are alive. Please, neighbors, come help us and save us." My kids and I couldn't move from our place. For 2 days, we were deprived of everything. Water, food, everything. We had no idea what was happening outside, except shootings, killings, and slaughters. I was one of those that was always against leaving the country and abandoning it, even though there was war. That night, my feelings changed. I prayed to God, if my kids and I make it out of this house alive, away from ISIS and all the killings, I wouldn't stay another second in Syria. So indeed, what this quote shows is that the decision to leave was forced on this person. And in order to survive and to protect her children, she simply had to make such a decision. And this generally fits the picture of refugees who are presented and whom we see as victims of their circumstances, and who are not only deprived of their sense of safety and security, who not only had to leave their home countries, but also they are deprived of their agency and the choice they have in this situation. Now, why is it important? So it is important because a sense of control and agency over one's fate, an important life decision, is a very fundamental human need. And we know that when such need is frustrated, it also leads to many negative psychological consequences. So therefore, the first result that I would like to show you might seem surprising, and it definitely surprised us. But it's also very important in our opinion, as it simply regards the agency and control that refugees feel they have in their situation. So yeah, well, we can move to this slide. So basically what we asked in our survey in all 4 countries, in Jordan, Lebanon, Germany, and the Netherlands, is the extent to which refugees felt they had control over their decision to come to the host country, to leave Syria and come to this country. And this, to walk you through this graph, basically they could indicate their answer on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 in meaning that they did not have any control over this decision, and 5 that they had high control over this decision. And what you can see here, I'm talking about the left graph, is that they felt particularly particularly in Jordan, Germany, and the Netherlands, that they had relatively high control over this decision. It was slightly lower in Lebanon, but it was still above the midpoint of the scale. So overall, they felt they had agency over this situation. We also asked them to what extent they felt it was up to them to make a decision to stay in the host country. And with the exception of Lebanon, where this mean is slightly lower, what you can see on this graph is that they feel it was up to them to stay in the host community. Now, we think it's very important to recognize the sense of agency and acknowledge, particularly because it goes against this view of refugees as being victims deprived of agency. And knowing that refugees do feel that they are in control of their migration decision, we think it matters for how aid is planned and to what extent refugees can be involved in this process, given that they have a sense of choice and agency. So what about the second part of this assumption that migration decisions or migration refugees situation is temporary? So first we can look at the statistics. So for example, data from 2019 revealed that in that year, only 400,000 refugees were able to return to their country of origin and less than 100,000 refugees were resettled. So when you compare it to millions of refugees that Arie mentioned earlier that are worldwide, these numbers are just a drop in the bucket. So the reality is that most refugees are neither repatriated nor resettled. And even when they are able to eventually go back to their country of origin, this process can take many, many years. So basically, this is not a temporary situation. This lasts many years, as mentioned earlier by Arie. However, the question is like, how do refugees perceive this situation? What are their wishes? What are their intentions in those circumstances? Could it be that despite this harsh reality, they still, over all those years, remain attached to the idea of going back to the country of origin? And again, this is something that we ask about in our research as well, so we have data that would speak to this question. So we can look at the next slide. So what you can see here is the answers of refugees in 2016 and 17, so in the first study that Arie mentioned, where we basically asked, how much would you like to go back to Syria? So the scale was from 1 to 7. 1, I would not want to go back, not at all. I wouldn't want to go back to Syria, and 7, yes, I would very much want to go back to Syria. So again, as you can see, across all 4 countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq, the means are very high. So they are between 5 and 6 on a 1 to 7 scale. So they indicate that they have very high motivation to go back to Syria. Majority of refugees simply wanted to go back home. We also asked in this survey whether they would maybe want to migrate elsewhere, for example, to the Western countries, and only a minority of refugees at that time considered migrating to Western countries. Now, things look differently a few years later. So in the second study, and now we can turn to the next slide, these are answers of refugees to a very similar question, whether they would want to move back to Syria in our second study. Basically, last year, we asked the same question in Jordan, Lebanon, Germany, and the Netherlands. And what you can see here is that only minority wishes to return to Syria. So the mean level of wanting to go back to Syria is relatively low, particularly when you compare it to those answers from 2016-17. So why is the trend looking like this? So we think there are 2 major reasons that are also present in the data that we collected in those studies. So the first thing is that refugees recognize the reality constraints that may simply prevent their return to Syria. So even though in the interviews with refugees in our focus groups, between 25 and 50% of participants expressed some interest in returning. However, they at the same time recognize that the likelihood of returning in the near future is very low. So they simply don't think it's feasible that they will be able to return, and that the situation in Syria will improve to the extent that they will be able to return safely and with their needs being satisfied upon return. So on the next slide, you'll see a quote from one of the participants in our focus groups that basically expresses these feelings. So he said, I feel that we will not go back in our lifetime, and that makes me think of, the thing that makes me think of returning is only my longing for my family. I only go to see my mother and my family, and I return to Lebanon. I do not think to return to Syria forever, and I think that it will not calm down ever. So basically, they recognize those limitations. They plan not to return to Syria on average, but rather find a life and live basically elsewhere. So on the next slide, what you'll see is the interest in staying in the host country. So in addition to asking them whether they would like to return to Syria, we also ask them whether they would simply want to stay where they currently were residing. So with the exception of Lebanon, and we'll come back to this case later during our presentation, as you can see, the mean levels of interest in staying in a host country is also very high. Again, here with the scale is from 1 to 5, and the means in Jordan, Germany, and the Netherlands are around 4 or even higher than 4, which suggests that refugees are highly motivated in staying where they are. So one reason why they would like to stay where they are is, of course, what I mentioned earlier, so the feasibility of going back to Syria. However, the second reason is also the treatment in their host country. So basically how they are treated, whether they feel their needs, psychological needs, are satisfied during their stay in the host country, and whether they think they are able to start a new life there. If they think so, then they desire to leave the host country and go back to Syria should be greatly reduced. And we were able to test this because in our studies, we also investigated the perception of the treatment that refugees received in the host communities. And it is important to note that, and we can switch to the next slide. It is important to know that the treatment refugees received was not 100% positive. So, of course, as refugees, they were also often faced with some limitations that were placed on either their employment, the healthcare they received, housing options. Similarly, the interactions with members of host communities were not 100% positive. Some were, of course, meaningful and deep, but others were simply negative. Or very banal. However, despite those mixed reactions and mixed treatment that they received, at the same time, during the interviews with refugees, they mentioned multiple times they were satisfied, for example, with the infrastructure, with the technology, with transportation, with utilities they had access to, with the safety, but also with some higher order concerns like freedoms or culture. So yes, it is true that the most obvious improvement in the situation upon moving to host country regarded their safety. So basically when they left Syria, they were no longer exposed to violence, to extremism, and this was definitely one of the most important changes that they mentioned during the interviews. And they felt that they didn't have to worry about the safety of their family, of their own safety. However, it was not the only thing that occurred in those interviews. And they also mentioned things related to, for example, freedom and freedom of speech, but also freedom of religion. And the next slide, the quote from one of the interviews illustrates these feelings. So what this person said is that all the negative things we talked about are nothing in comparison with one thing. I'm free. I say what I want. I express myself as I like. I felt my humanity, this feeling I was missing in my country. I have no limits, and I removed all the limits from my mind. I feel now I can show my insight to people. The most beautiful thing for me I felt in this country. So as you can see, that needs and concerns that were important to refugees are not only those that are related to security and safety and whether they have access to food and water. Of course, these are important concerns, but these are not the only thing that matter in this situation. And in our research, we also wanted to examine these ideas, these needs by looking at simply the wider spectrum of psychological needs. So yes, we measured the level of satisfaction with the basic needs of refugees. So to what extent they felt that their needs for shelter, for safety, for economic security were met in the host communities. But we also measured the extent to which refugees felt that their higher order needs were satisfied or frustrated. So to what extent they felt significant, personally significant, to what extent they felt that they were recognized, respected, treated with dignity, accepted in the host communities, or to what extent they were humiliated, they were rejected, they felt insignificant. And this could apply to them personally, individually, but also we ask about those feelings of insignificance on a collective level, as refugees, as a group. So first, let's look at how the refugees felt feeling those host countries. So what you can see here are those two types of needs that I just mentioned. So on the right side of the slide, you see a level of satisfaction with the basic needs. So as I said, basic needs related to safety, economic security, access to food and water. And what you can see here, the higher scores on this right graph indicate satisfaction with basic needs. So in the countries, in the European countries, in Germany and in the Netherlands, refugees were slightly more satisfied with the basic needs, and overall they were satisfied. As you can see, the mean here is 4 on 1 to 5 scale, indicating rather high level of satisfaction with the basic needs. The satisfaction level is slightly lower in Jordan, and is the lowest of all those 4 countries in Lebanon. Again, a theme that we will also come back to this later. Now we can turn to those 2 other graphs that represent those feelings of insignificance, of humiliation, of disrespect that refugees encountered in the host countries. The left side represents individual level of insignificance, and the middle graph represents the group insignificance that they experience. So here, what you can see is that the low levels of those feelings of insignificance in 3 countries, so in Jordan, in Germany, and in the Netherlands, suggests that refugees felt rather welcomed, rather accepted, respected, and treated with dignity. Again, Lebanon is a slight exception from this rule, and we'll discuss it later in greater detail. So the question is, okay, so we see how the mean level is present in those with regard to higher order needs and basic needs. Now, do both of those needs matter for example, migration intentions of refugees? Is it, for example, related to their willingness to stay in the host country? And more importantly, is it only that their basic needs matter, or is it that those higher order needs for respect and personal significance also are related to willingness to stay in a host country? And this will be the last graph that I would like to show you. It's on the next slide. It might seem a bit complex, but I'll try to walk you through all those dots and lines. So let's start with, again, the right graph on the right side. What those graphs show is the relationship between satisfaction of basic needs and willingness to stay in a host country. So what this graph shows is that the higher satisfaction, those lines suggest that the higher satisfaction with the basic needs in all 4 countries, but this relationship is slightly more stronger in the Western European countries, then the more refugees would like to stay in this country. Again, it's not very surprising, nothing controversial here. Now, what's important for us, and I think it's important to remember when you think about needs of refugees, is those 2 other graphs, which basically show that the relationship between higher order needs and willingness to stay in a host community is also very strong. And it's actually stronger than the relationship to basic needs. So it means that the way refugees are treated in a host communities, whether they feel welcomed, whether they feel accepted, respected, and recognized, plays a role for what they would like, whether they would like to stay in this country or not. So to summarize the things that I said, I would say that yes, we recognize that refugee situation is due to external circumstances, and it definitely feels as a forced situation. However, it doesn't mean that in this situation refugees are deprived of their sense of agency and choice in this situation, and it's definitely important to recognize it and acknowledge it. Is it temporary? It's not temporary. Refugees recognize that it's not temporary, but also importantly, their motivation for staying versus going back also changes over time, probably in recognition of this, that the situation is not temporary. And finally, even though this first assumption, in the first assumption I mentioned that focus on basic needs is very high, it's important, and what comes out of our research is that also higher order needs for respect and significance also matter for migration decisions of refugees. And now Enrica Molinario will discuss the second assumption. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Katarzyna. Next slide, please. And thank you everyone for being here today. So the second assumption we address within our research program is that refugees in general and Iraqi and Syrian refugees more specifically pose a threat to host countries. Next slide, please. Refugees are in fact often portrayed in Western countries by both media and politicians as enemies and as a threat. This negative perception of refugees is popular not only in media and politicians' narratives, but it is a perception shared by the general population as well. For example, on this slide, you can see two graphs representing American and European opinions on refugees. The graph on the left shows the general fear that Iraqi and Syrian refugees elicit in Americans, and it shows that a significant percentage of respondents see refugees as a major or a minor threat. While the graph on the right summarizes the opinion about refugees in several European countries, and as you can see, the percentage of people in Europe who believe that refugees will increase the likelihood of terrorism is pretty high. So although the popularity of assumption 2, there is a little evidence that supports its validity. To study this issue, we looked at the level of extremism among refugees residing in Middle Eastern and European host countries, and we examined the extent to which these extreme beliefs were related to their migration intention. Next slide, please. These graphs summarize the results we obtained with data collected between 2016 and 2017. The graphs at the top of the slide represent the relationship between Islamist extremism and the intention to migrate to the West, while the graphs at the bottom of the slide represent the relation between Islamist extremism and the intention to go back to Syria across the 4 countries that we targeted. To measure Islamist extremism in our study, we used a set of questions that captured the individual's commitment to fundamental Islamic doctrine, including support for violence for religion. As you can see by looking at the declining line in the first row of the graphs, the refugees most interested in moving to the West are also less likely to endorse Islamist extremism. In contrast, the ideological extreme individuals appear to be more willing to return to their homeland, so in Syria. And this is represented by the increasing lines in the second row of the graphs. So these first results provide some evidence that goes against assumption 2. If assumption 2 was correct, we will have expected the refugees who had extreme beliefs will be more willing to move to the West, most likely to strike attacks and terrorist attacks to the West. Instead, here we find the opposite. So based on our results, the refugees who want to go to the West do not represent a threat to security of Western countries. Next slide, please. To provide more evidence supporting these claims, we looked at the level of extremism of refugees who already moved to other countries in 2020. As you can see by looking at these graphs, the level of extremism of Syrian refugees who in 2020 lived in Middle Eastern countries and European countries is pretty low. In fact, the means of the responses given on measures of extremism are around or below 3, which represents the midpoint, which suggests refugees' neutral opinion or total disagreement with these questions measuring extremism. To notice that here we measured extremism in 3 different ways, such as commitment to fundamental Islamic doctrine, as we did in the data that I showed you earlier, and as a willingness to make sacrifices for religion and willingness to perpetrate violence toward the West. Across these three measures of extremism, the results show the Syrian refugees report low levels of extremism, especially if they reside in Europe, namely in the Netherlands and Germany. Taken together, these results suggest that those who are religious or fundamentalists want to return to their home country, so in Syria. Instead, those who are less fundamentalist move to the West. And refugees who indeed migrated to Europe are not extreme, and even less extreme than who is currently in the Middle East. To sum up, our results provide some evidence that the assumption that refugees are a threat to the West is wrong, and that the refugees' ideological and religious beliefs matter when refugees make decisions regarding to their relocation. Now I leave the floor to David, who will discuss the third assumption we addressed in our research program.
Thank you, Erica. It's a pleasure to be here today to be able to share our research results with all of you who have tuned in. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to talk about our third and final assumption that guided our research presentation. And that assumption is that refugees are individuals that have made individual migration decisions. We borrowed this idea from a 2016 paper written by George Rupp. Rupp is a former president of an international humanitarian aid and relief organization. And in 2016, Rupp made the observation that our main efforts to assist in refugee crises are individualistic, meaning that we provide aid at a very individual level to individuals and of course to their families sometimes who have been impacted by conflict and violence. What Rupp proposes and what we agree with is that although this is the way aid functions, and this is a very important way for aid to function, if we really want to tackle refugee circumstances, we might be better off by dealing with it in a collectivistic approach, or an approach that focuses on the communities that were impacted, right? So the communities here from where the refugees originate back in their home countries, but also the communities in the host countries in which they have migrated to as refugees. And we take this perspective in our work because the losses of refugees are not only individual, but they are also social. Refugees were uprooted from their networks of friends and relatives. These were individuals who had accepted them, respected them, and lent them that sense of significance that Kasia was talking about before. A refugee's success in a new country is not just a function of their individual ability, their individual work ethic, or their individual malleability to circumstances. It's also a function of how well they are received, accepted, and supported within their new host communities. Aid can only do so much if refugees are trying to succeed in communities that do not want to see them succeed. And we believe a good example of this importance of communities can be found in some of the data that Kasia had presented earlier pertaining to looking at Lebanon relative to other countries. So you'll recall that the refugees in Lebanon reported a lesser interest in staying in their host country relative to other refugees. They also reported a greater interest in returning to Syria. Okay. On top of that, they reported that their fulfillment of their basic needs, things for economic stability, security, housing, food, and water, these types of things were less likely to be fulfilled, but so were their feelings of significance and respect, less likely to be fulfilled in Lebanon than in other countries. And we think what might be going on here could partially be explained by the interrelations between the Syrians and the Lebanese people who population that they're trying to resettle in. Now, all of the data that we have discussed so far has come from the refugees and from the different surveys and focus groups that we've conducted. But as Arie mentioned this earlier, we also conducted both focus groups and surveys, not only with the refugees, but with members of the host communities, right? So we went into Germany, Netherlands, Lebanon, and Jordan. We didn't just talk to the refugees, we also spoke to the natives there that lived in the communities where the refugees lived. And so what I wanted to present at the end of this talk is a little bit of the data from the host community. If you want to go to the next slide, please. What you see on this slide is a presentation of two different types of attitudes held by members of these host communities. On the left of the screen, we have what we're labeling threat perceptions. So this is the belief held by the host community that refugees pose a threat to the host community and to the country. On the right side of the screen, we have a composite score that looks at overall negativity of stereotypes. In the surveys here, what we did is we asked participants, we provided them with a series of 10 different traits, and we asked them to rate how well they thought those traits described Syrian refugees. These were things like incompetence, sociability, immorality, aggressiveness, impurity. And we wanted to see the extent to which they held these types of attitudes. Higher scores on this scale here represents more negativity. Now, so what we can see here is we're mimicking the pattern that we have shown earlier, where Lebanon appears to be different than the other countries. Right? So both in terms of threat perceptions and these negative stereotypes, the host community that lives in Lebanon, and to some extent also in the Netherlands, reports a higher more negative attitudes about refugees. Now, if you want to go to the next slide. Now, importantly, we didn't just look at these beliefs among the host community, but we also looked at them with refugees. This is something that is termed in the psychology world as metaperceptions. Okay, now, in this case, what is a metaperception? It represents the extent to which a refugee thinks the host community holds negative attitudes about them. Okay, so the extent to which a refugee thinks the host community holds negative attitudes about them. And as you can see on the figures in your screen, there are kind of two patterns that really played out here. First, what you can see is that refugees are fairly accurate at picking up the attitudes of the host community. Right? So the blue bars here that represent the refugee attitudes mimic fairly closely the green bars that represent the host community. So when refugees live in a host community that harbors negative attitudes towards them, they pick up on that and they report thinking that the host community feels this way. The other pattern is the same one that I've been talking about so far, which is that Lebanon looks different than the other communities that we enter, right? So the refugees who reside in Lebanon feel that the host community views them more negatively than do refugees in any other community. Now, I should also point out we explored these metaperceptions not only in our surveys, but also in our focus groups. So in the surveys, we provided refugees with 10 traits to rate on. But in the focus groups, we wanted to see, how did refugees think if we just asked them the question, what do you think the host community thinks about you, right? What are the perceptions that they offer up on their own without any kind of guidance? We then coded the statements that they made for 11 different types of perceptions that they could discuss. And in that discussion, what we found far and away, the most common perception held by refugees was this idea that they're viewed as a threat. So 50% of this discussion centered around the idea that refugees think the host community perceives them as a threat to the host community. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a quote from one of these focus groups that gives you an example of how they feel. Most people say that Syrians are the main cause for their problems. For example, some of them blame us for the lack of water. They say that we steal their water. Others blame us for the lack of job opportunities, and others say that we bring terrorism with us. Now, what we found when we analyzed these focus groups a little bit more in a more nuanced way was that these threat perceptions centered around three ideas. The first idea, two of those you see on the screen. The first one was this idea of economic threat, that refugees pose a threat to the economic security of the host community. This usually centered around stealing jobs, increasing housing prices. The second one that's also on the screen is pertaining to crime or the threat of terrorism. So the many refugees discussed how they think the host community sees them as increasing crime, making the communities less safe, and bringing this threat of terrorism. The third way that these threat perceptions played out pertained more to the cultural or ideological components of the communities. And the threat in more of these symbolic ways. So for instance, women refugees in Lebanon particularly felt that the Lebanese feared that they were stealing all the good Lebanese men away from the women. A refugee in the Netherlands also discussed how she felt the Dutch were very fearful that they were Muslims and that they were going to come in and change religion and change ideology and threaten their culture in this sense. Now, it's interesting that the refugees hold these metaperceptions, right? But what's more important is understanding if there are ramifications of holding these metaperceptions. If a refugee picks up on the idea that a host community holds hostility for them, what ramifications does that have for their successful migration into that country? And if you go to the next slide, please. What we found here was that higher metaperceptions of threat were related to a series of negative migration outcomes. Fewer intergroup interactions, less integration within the host community, less interest staying in the host country, and finally a greater support of violent extremism. Right? So for instance, what we find is when refugees think that the host community holds negative attitudes and sees them as a threat, they now are more anxious when we ask them to think about how they would feel interacting with a member of that host group. And as a result, they also report having fewer intergroup interactions with these individuals. And when they have interactions, they also report having more negative interactions here. This then leads to lower integration within the society, less interested and less interest in staying there. Now, this latter finding here, this greater support of violent extremism, I think is a fascinating one as well. If you think back to the results that Erica discussed, we know that the refugees are very low in their endorsement of violent extremism, and that those who want to move to the West, for instance, are even lower in these views. Okay. But what we tend to see, what these findings here are suggesting, is that we might be seeing kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If refugees are received by a community in a negative way, and that community views them as a threat and treats them as such, this then leads to an increased endorsement of violence, right? So by treating the refugees as a threat, these host communities may actually be creating a threat that didn't ever exist. Now, these correlations that we found, they held across all 4 of the countries that we surveyed refugees in. But we also think it helps us to understand particularly what's going on in Lebanon, right? Why the refugees are struggling so much in Lebanon relative to these other communities. And it shows, we think, this importance of looking at the interactions between the refugee population and the host community population. And this begs the question then of what is going on in Lebanon? Why are the intergroup relations between the Syrians and the Lebanese different than they are in these other countries? And if you want to go to the next slide, please. There are a few things that, we pointed to, that we look to, that we think might help explain what's going on in Lebanon relative to these other countries. I do want to, as an aside, point out that we are not experts on the Middle East, or we're not experts on Lebanon. So if those of you in the room are, we're interested in hearing your thoughts on this as well. But the first thing that sets Lebanon apart from these other countries is that Lebanon may have not taken in the most refugees, but they have taken in the most refugees per capita. Okay, so refugees comprise roughly 20% of the Lebanese population. 1 in every 5 people who lives in Lebanon is a refugee. And that creates a dynamic between these populations that is very different than these other countries, where refugees comprise a very small percentage of the population. The other thing that we've found is that Lebanon was simply unprepared to take in as many refugees as they did. As a country, as a government, they were unable to anticipate the conflict that happened in Syria, and particularly the scale of that conflict and how the ramifications of that in terms of who would flee and how many people they would need to take in. Indeed, back in 2013, a study was done by the World Bank along with the UNHCR that looked at the impact of the refugee crisis on Lebanon. And at the time, it was estimated that the Syrian refugee crisis led to a $1.5 billion hit on the economy in Lebanon, and that it pushed more than 150,000 Lebanese into poverty. This report also discussed how the crisis highly stressed public services and infrastructure, to the point that billions of dollars would need to be spent to bring both of these sectors back to their pre-refugee crisis states. So we see early on in the crisis, there was a tangible negative impact of the refugees. And what we have seen since then is that the refugees have continued to be blamed for all of the struggles of the Lebanese and for the entire country, regardless of how right that blame may be. Right? So we know that Lebanon's economy collapsed this past year after decades of economic mismanagement and corruption. Okay? On top of that, of course, we are all going through the COVID pandemic that has rocked economies across the globe. This had an impact in Lebanon. And you'll recall back in August, there was an explosion that ripped through Beirut. And this explosion forced 300,000 people into homelessness. We're in a situation in Lebanon where there are places around the country that only have electricity for several hours a day, right? The Lebanese population is highly stressed, forced into poverty, and many of them are food insecure. And when a community is going through such dire circumstances, the refugees become an easy scapegoat for the country's problems, particularly given the volatile relationships that exist between Syria and Lebanon because of the history between these countries. And when we spoke to the Lebanese in our focus groups, this is exactly what we found. We found that they were engaged in this scapegoating process of blaming the Syrian refugees, particularly for taking away housing and taking away jobs. Let me give you a quote from one of these individuals. This is a Syrian speaking here. Everything became, this is a Lebanese individual speaking here. Everything became Syrian here. The grocery stores are Syrian, the barbers are Syrian, electricians, plumbers, tile workers, all Syrian, everything. Only the air became Lebanese, right? And what we saw in these focus groups was that these individuals were talking about this idea that they recognize that Syrians are hardworking, but they also feel that Syrians are willing to work for less money. And because everybody is struggling in the economy, when businesses and employers have an opportunity to hire, they're going to take someone who will do just as good of a job for less pay 9 times out of 10, right? And so they then feel like the jobs are being taken from them. On top of that, they feel that because they're refugees, they feel that the government is giving them a lot of other benefits, maybe free healthcare, not making them pay taxes, giving them other benefits. And you compound that and they feel that this is a very unfair situation. And it has led to a souring of relations between these groups. In recent years, we have seen extreme measures taken by the Lebanese government to try and force refugees out and to try and portray them in this negative light. Okay. Now, as is the case when a lot of this happened, it's a scapegoating issue, right? It's not always based in reality. So for instance, the American task force in Lebanon in 2019 reported that refugees have only accounted for about a 1% increase in crime, even though the narrative about them is that they're causing crime and bringing terrorism, right? They also found that Lebanon, if you look at jobs, and you look at the number of jobs created per year, Lebanon is actually creating about 3 times as many jobs per year since the refugee crisis relative to the time period before that crisis, right? So we think that this doesn't point so much to reality, but it helps us to understand the souring of relations between these two communities, which can then help us really to understand why is it that the Syrian refugees in Lebanon are struggling so hard to fit in, have so less interest in staying and are much more interested in returning to Syria relative to those in other countries. And it highlights, yes, we need to look at it from this individual perspective. We need to continue to provide aid in these ways. But if we really want to deal with these situations, we need to take a more holistic approach that looks at the communities that are involved. On that note, I will throw this back to Arie for some concluding statements.
If I can have the next slide, please. The next bullet. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Katarzyna, for these interesting findings. To wrap up, our research suggests that widely held assumptions about refugees are incorrect, are inaccurate. The notion that they are a temporary problem is largely inaccurate. Initially, they fully intend to go back home, but over time, people adapt and their perspective changes. Return turns out to be unfeasible. And because the conditions that cause them to flee their country of origin are often still there. The conflict is still raging. Furthermore, they get acclimated to their host country and begin to see their future there. From refugees, they turn into immigrants. The second bullet, please. The widespread notion that they pose a general threat of terrorism also is inaccurate. They ended up in the host country not because they wanted to go to war and spread violence and terror, but because they ran for their lives and away from violence that was engulfing their countries. And those who immigrated to Europe and the West were hoping to assimilate, to integrate, to find themselves in those countries. They expected that their needs would be met in the West, both their basic subsistence needs and, more importantly perhaps, their significance needs for respect and acceptance. The notion that their problem is mainly an individual type of problem is also incorrect. The problem is social, one of belonging, being recognized, have a status as refugee that is not negative, that is not evoking prejudice and rejection. They want to feel that in the host country, they are significant and respected. And these issues that our findings illuminate would need to be taken into account in forming a comprehensive new approach to the refugee challenge. The problem is already of immense proportions, and it's not handled carefully and globally. Hoda mentioned the global governance. Well, it's global governance that is challenged to deal with this problem. The fact that such a large number of refugees spilled into Lebanon that accepted them for humanitarian reason doesn't mean that Lebanon is prepared, is equipped to deal with this flux of refugees. So it's the international community that needs to find ways of dispersing the refugees to a variety of nations in accordance with their abilities to absorb them, and given the international aid that will be divided among countries that accept and absorb refugees. And again, you know, this problem is likely to be exacerbated in the foreseeable future, given the disasters expected due to climate change, rising sea levels, droughts, food and water shortages. So it's high time that the world gave it the attention that it deserves. A final comment is that, you know, as it is typical of these kind of scientific presentations, our talk was about graphs, about averages, about quotes. It was antiseptic and clinical. But the phenomenon of refugees is hardly that. It's acute and it's fraught with great pain and suffering. The refugees' journey is dangerous and hazardous. Many of them die on the way to the promised land. Others are taken advantage of by organized crime. They become the victims of human trafficking, prostitution, pedophilia, etc. So it is our humanitarian duty to provide them the kind of conditions that respect their humanity. It is a moral duty, but also a social imperative, because their frustration can turn to anger, and their anger can turn to violence and conflict. In today's world, we're all interdependent and must take care of each other. The refugee issue illustrates this truth perhaps like no other, and it's a major challenge for global governance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation of your research. It really provides us with so many insights into this issue of refugees, especially the Syrian refugees. And I would like to now ask the audience to please begin asking your questions by going to the Q&A function. We have one question already from, I hope I don't mess up this name, but it's from Wanhiku Kagira. Who is the end user of your research, and how does it assist the refugee community?
Maybe I could answer that question. We are funded by the MINERVA program, which is a program that encourages basic research on general social problems in the Department of Defense. This does not impact our findings. Our findings are based on our scientific goals and objectives. We have a great interest in understanding the problem of refugees. Hopefully, the results will inform policy, not only of the Department of Defense, but in the United Nations, the global governance, the bodies, the NGOs, understanding the refugee problem is of utmost importance, and we are grateful to being able to be able to carry out this research. As you can imagine, this is a very difficult research to carry out. It involves different countries, different languages, different surveys, access to refugees, access to communities. So it's a very costly research, and we could not have done it without the funding that we received, to which we are grateful. But the results are the main issue of this research and what is done with these results. And we want to carry the message to all the different bodies. This is just the first presentation. We'll carry out a series of presentations to arouse people's understanding and appreciation of what we are dealing with and how important the refugee problem is worldwide.
I'll just chime in there really quick if I can as well. The MINERVA initiative does a really good job of trying to hook us into government employees as well. So there are always yearly presentations where we're not just presenting with academic audiences, but we are presenting with people who are in various parts of the government who are working on these issues and dealing with them. And it gives us a direct voice to these individuals on top of the speaking engagements and the publications that we hope to undertake ourselves.
Thank you. The next question from Neda Moayad. Which country is making better progress in resettlement of Syrian refugees?
Kasia, would you like to address that?
I can try, although I think it won't be a very direct answer to this question. So maybe if someone else wants to follow up, it would be great. Because I think what we're studying in our research is not like objective indicators of resettlement. What we can speak to is the subjective perceptions of refugees, of how they see they are being treated, and those means and averages that we were showing show that, for example, with regard to basic needs, the level of satisfaction in Western Europe was slightly higher than in the Middle Eastern countries. With regard to significance and those higher order needs, we can see that European countries and Jordan are very similar, but here the Lebanon, the level of satisfaction is lower and feelings of insignificance are higher. But I don't think that speaks directly to the question. So if someone wants to add something on more.
I can add to that based on my knowledge of other types of refugees. I know, for example, that in Jordan, a project was initiated by funds from a variety of different sources that was meant to employ refugees and allow them to work. And that was a very blessed initiative, and created both contributed to Jordan as a country and solved refugees' employment problem. I know that in Uganda, African refugees from South Sudan were treated to land and allowed an opportunity to address their economic and significance needs. So there are countries that are beginning to grapple with that on the individual basis. But I think that global governance has to see that as a major challenge in planning the disbursement of funds and the distribution of refugees across countries as their capabilities allow. So even though there are some interesting successes in Jordan and Uganda, we need to do much more in terms of a systematic treatment of the refugee problem.
And I would say, just to build on that a little bit as well, the statistic that Kasia had discussed earlier in our talk, I think, was that in 2019, only 65,000 refugees were resettled out of the entire millions that are out, right? So as Arie is saying, we're seeing globally, we're not doing a good enough job in resettlement, regardless of which countries might be doing better than others.
I think as a follow-up, if I may ask, I keep hearing global governance, the issue of global governance. And my question is this: what are our obligations to refugees? And is there any good example of how global governance has responded in a positive way to a refugee crisis?
If I can jump into this question, I think our obligation is twofold. It's a moral obligation to provide refuge of people in need who are suffering, to alleviate their suffering, to provide the basic needs for safety. But it is also to allow them to realize their humanity. The idea that it's a temporary problem is belied by the facts. And I think that whereas we viewed it as a short-term humanitarian problem and provided the basic necessities through the UN, we need to rethink that issue in light of the changing circumstances. So United Nations is probably the basic institution that needs to rethink and with the help of other major institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, create an infrastructure of absorbing the refugees and attending to their both basic and significance needs so that their suffering would be alleviated. Otherwise, it turns to frustration and it turns to violence. You know, major Islamist movements like Al-Qaeda, like Hizb al-Tahrir, you know, major militant organizations started with refugees. So, you know, that suffering finally erupts. So it's both a moral problem and also a social problem that we are interdependent. And if we allow frustration to grow and suffering to grow, we are all going to pay a price at the end.
Thank you. The next question is from David Millar. This intersects with a growing backlash against liberal ideas and institutions worldwide. International law provides for refugee status and reintegration, but many ordinary people feel that economic opportunities and social services rightfully belong only to the birthright citizens of that country. How do we build an ordinary popular consensus for the idea of refugee integration?
David, would you like to address that?
Sure, I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the ways we can maybe approach this from our research is that part of this backlash comes from this fear of the other, right? This fear that these individuals are going to bring a threat. And we see these highly held perceptions that not only are they different from us, they're not from here, they don't deserve this money, but if they come here, they're going to make the situation worse for us. And I think if we can hopefully educate these populations through efforts like our research to show them that, you know, refugees don't actually pose the threat that you think they do pose, these efforts should hopefully work to improve these types of relations and hopefully bring people on board. Now, that's just a drop in the bucket of what we would have to do, but I think that's one way that our research can speak to efforts that we could engage in.
There are two things here. One is the realities on the ground. People fear that the refugees would cause unemployment, will take jobs away. Some economists have recently published data on refugees in Europe, and in fact, both in Southern Europe and in Northern Europe, the greater the number of the refugees, the lesser the unemployment. Refugees create jobs by being a cheaper labor force that allows businesses to reopen, and also by bringing investment. So the realities on the ground belie the fears. But as David pointed out, there is something more fundamental here. There's a fear of the other. We need, in this interconnected, flat world, learn how to live with differences. We must not agree with differences, but differences are here to stay. The migrations, the intercommunication, the influx of movement, the movement of populations is not something that can be reversed. We need to live with differences. We need to learn how to do it, desensitize ourselves to the fact that not everybody is like ourselves. This is a major job in 21st century.
Got me thinking more as Arie was talking from some of the stuff that was discussed in our focus groups as well. So not only being more accepting of differences, but also maybe pointing out that a lot of these communities recognize there's a benefit of bringing refugees in, right? So they brought in more diverse food and more diverse culture, and the host communities loved these types of things that the refugee communities were bringing in. And so I think if we can highlight the importance of Arie's talking about, also highlight how these can improve our society overall by the things that they will bring in, tangible impact that they'll have on our culture and our communities, would be fantastic.
Anyone else from the panel? No?
I think maybe I could add just like a small thing to that, maybe not necessarily from our current research, but like from general psychological theory, this perception of relations between host communities and refugees as like zero-sum game. This is, I think, the part of the problem, right? If we can reframe the relations as relations where anyone can, like both sides can benefit from it, something that David also mentioned, I think this could improve, as you know, research suggests that it could improve relations between groups. So maybe that's another way to do it, like increase knowledge, of course, and appreciate the differences, but also show how we can all benefit from it.
Thank you. The next question is from Nuruddin Shah. Your research is very interesting and thank you for a great presentation. What is the situation of refugees in rich countries in the Middle East, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia? Is there little support from rich Muslim countries, unlike Germany?
From my understanding, I think the answer is that there's little support from these countries. Those countries are taking in very few refugees, more than, I would assume probably more than we are here in the United States, because we take in practically zero, but they're not taking in the numbers that these other countries are.
I agree with that, yes. So, you know, different countries, the countries that are immediate neighbors usually are confronted with these masses of refugees, and it's very difficult to refuse them. And they enter, you know, there's over close to 1 million refugees in Lebanon. There's close to that number in Jordan. So these are the immediate neighbors are the ones that absorb the brunt. Further away countries are less under pressure to admit the refugees. It's more complicated to get there. And to the extent that they are adamant about refusing the refugees are not getting there. And again, which suggests that, you know, it's the international community that needs to get together. We have all these summit meetings of international economic and other communities. This has to be on the agenda because the problem is really immense and growing in size.
Thank you. Next question, again from Wanhiku Kagiri. Do you have any suggestions how to avoid root causes of chaos, to avoid refugee situations occurring in the first place?
Well, that's a very fundamental question. How do we avoid violence and militancy? I think it starts with a sense of injustice, a sense of inequality, a sense of deprivation. We need to create just societies. We have made many attempts in the past, that many utopias that did not pan out. We have to learn from the psychology of the situations. People would not be suppressed for too long. You cannot create inequalities. You cannot create autocracies that would disenfranchise millions of people. There will be frustration, there will be anger. We need to have a just society, a fair society, to minimize that kind of rage that accumulates and that breeds conflict. So, you know, we have this in our human nature, the possibility for aggression, the possibility for violence. That's how we are built. The struggle between the human nature and civilization is to try to curb these tendencies by creating culture, by creating civilization, by creating governance that takes care of those tendencies and suppresses the more negative impulses that we are capable of.
Thank you. From Marjorie Dixon, thank you for an insightful presentation. Do you feel that your work can help point the way to minimizing the need for migration from fear and disruption? Can dysfunctional governments be held accountable for the internal dysfunctions?
Anybody? Erica, you didn't speak?
So I don't think our results can speak to this question. I definitely there is a role of governments, and I'm not sure to what extent they can be held accountable for the internal dysfunction, but it is true that some of these dysfunctions are created by conflicts, and so governments have a role. And definitely there is a role of governments in dealing with this problem worldwide, in Europe, in the Middle East in itself. Again, not sure to what extent we can respond to this, but definitely we can provide some new insights to government in order to open their minds about what is the real problem with refugees in general, Syrian refugees more specifically, and how we can provide definitely some suggestions on how to deal with the refugees problem, as the other speakers have pointed out, to focus more on communities, creating programs that the governments should provide in the first place, and that should be spread and used on local level in order to deal with the refugees problems worldwide. I don't know whether there is anybody else who wants to add something.
I want to add to that, Erica. I think as psychologists and as social scientists, we understand the issues involved to some considerable extent. To translate it into policy is a very different matter altogether. You need to have the will of politicians to promote a just society, as opposed to accumulating power. And you know, the more people we can, as scientists, convince to work toward that end, the sooner this situation will come about. But you know, there are conflicting motivations. There's a motivation for power and aggrandizement that feeds on misery, because people who are miserable can be mobilized into all kinds of movements, you know, autocratic movements, populist movements, nationalistic movements, and other type of aggressive organizations. So we understand the problem. To translate what we understand into policies that will improve the world, there is a lot of intermediate steps that have to happen before that ideal state of affairs can be achieved.
Thank you. I think we have time for two more questions. This one is from Tiffany Razavi. Thank you for your excellent presentation. What patterns, if any, do your data show in terms of generational or gender differences in the experience or perception of refugees?
Maybe I
Go
can
ahead.
start.
You go, Kasia.
One, because so I cannot say about all the variables that we studied in our slides, because we didn't explore the relationship between gender or age and all the variables. However, we looked at, for example, relationship between age and gender, as well as, for example, socioeconomic status and those migration intentions. So whether they would like to go back to Syria, or whether they would like to, for example, migrate to a Western country. And basically, those relationships were very weak, in most cases, very close to zero. And if there was significant, meaningful relationship, it wasn't consistent across all countries. So basically, we, on the basis of those two factors, like where they would like to go and migrate, go back home or migrate to a Western country, those two factors didn't seem to play a role, which is to some extent surprising to us, but I don't know if we can speak to the perceptions on the base of refugees, but among refugees, these factors didn't seem to be consistent or strong predictors of either their political and social opinions or migration decisions.
And I'll just add to that, I would say for a lot of the variables we looked at, our hypotheses were, and the theory that we had were that it should apply for all people regardless of age or gender. And so our analytical approach has been controlling for gender, less than looking directly for gender differences, because we didn't hypothesize those differences to exist when it came to other variables that we were looking at.
Thank you. From David Montgomery, if we see the refugee problem as something quite likely to increase due to climate change, labor needs, conflict, etc., and bring with it tensions over integration, do we find the nature of migration has an impact over how the challenge is faced? It seems generally a problem of living with difference, but does the reason behind migration impact the challenges to acceptance?
Thank you, David, for this question. As I mentioned, that living with differences has to be part of the solution. The nature of the migration particularly resides in the volume of migration. It is a problem that is swelling in size, and because of its great volume, it becomes an imperative to translate the insights that you and others have had about living with differences. We in psychology talked about contact hypotheses. These were relatively limited initiatives that have to be, given the volume of the problem, have to be translated into initiatives that are much more widespread, much more part of different institutions of society. It has to be something that is attempted at schools, social services, immigration institutions, police, all the churches, religious institutions. This idea of differences and living with differences has to become a major tool, because the diversity that we are experiencing all around us is going to grow. And if we have this antipathy to differences, this fear of differences, this dread of the other, the world is going to erupt and fractionate and fragment and erupt into war and conflict. So I think it's a very important and timely issue right at this time.
If I can add one thing, because this question, which I think is a very good question, points out to a very important factor in reactions to migrants and refugees. It reminded me of a research that is a great research, and unfortunately it's not our research, but it's about decisions to grant asylum and what factors play a role in whether a person, just like people from different European countries in participating in this research, what factors accounted for their willingness to grant asylum to asylum seeker. And one of the factors that was an important factor was the reason for seeking asylum. So basically, when someone was wanting to migrate due to economic reasons, then the willingness to admit such a person was lower than when they were fleeing violence or persecution, or they were experiencing some traumatic, they had some traumatic experiences in the past. So that suggests that yes, the reason for being a refugee, for being a migrant plays a role, and it can impact at least the initial willingness, and probably it could also impact the subsequent reactions to different types of migrants. So I think it's very important to study that and to look at this factor as well.
I think that brings us to all of our questions, and I can't thank all of you enough. Dr. Kruglanski, Dr. Jasko, Dr. Molinario, Dr. Weber, for your exquisite presentation. You really have given us so much information about such an important issue. And I think there's, as the days go on, we will be reflecting on what you have told us during this very important symposium. As I mentioned early on, we have recorded this symposium and it will be posted on the Baha'i Chair YouTube channel, and we'll send an announcement out on our social media when the video is ready. I think I just need to announce our next event. If I could have a slide, Kate, for that. Our next events, well, you can see all of them, but the immediate next event is on February 16, Racial Inequalities and Health. Professor Stephen Thomas from the University of Maryland's College of Public Health will address, I think the title of his talk is something like The Colors of COVID-19. And then you see the other events that are listed, but I suggest that you follow us on social media and go to our website, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Again, my thanks to the panelists today. Thank you.